Imagine, if you will, that you have just been granted the greatest honor of your life. You have been invited to the Palace of Versailles. You have spent months, perhaps years, scheming, bribing, and flattering your way into the French court. You have borrowed money you do not have to buy clothes you cannot afford. You have rehearsed your bow in the mirror until your back aches. You have memorized the protocols, the hierarchies, the particular angle at which one must tilt one's head when addressing a duchess versus a countess. And then you arrive. The palace is, without question, the most breathtaking structure you have ever seen. The Hall of Mirrors stretches before you like a dream made of glass and gold. The gardens roll outward in geometric perfection, fountains catching sunlight like scattered diamonds. You are surrounded by the most powerful, most elegant, most fashionable people in the Western world. Men in silk coats and powdered wigs, women in towering hairstyles, decorated with ships and bird cages and tiny mechanical gardens. Then you notice the smell. It is not subtle. It hits you somewhere around the second antechamber, a warm and intimate assault on the nostrils that no amount of perfume, and there is a great deal of perfume, can fully conceal. It is the smell of tens of thousands of human beings living in a building that, despite its 700 rooms, its acres of marble, its armies of servants, was designed with almost no thought whatsoever given to sanitation. Welcome to Versailles. Population, approximately 20,000. Functioning toilets, essentially zero. This is the story of the most powerful court in the world and what it was actually like to live, breathe, eat, sleep, and occasionally relieve yourself inside it. Strip away the mythology of the Sun King and what you find beneath is something simultaneously hilarious and horrifying. A monument to human contradiction, where civilization's most elaborate rituals of refinement were performed against a backdrop of breathtaking filth. It is, in short, the greatest absurdist theater in history. To understand the sanitary catastrophe of Versailles, you must first understand how it came to be. Louis XIV, Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King, transformed what had been his father's modest hunting lodge into the most opulent palace Europe had ever seen. Construction began in earnest in the 1660s and continued for decades. At its peak, Versailles employed 36,000 laborers and 6,000 horses simultaneously. No expense was spared on the Hall of Mirrors, on the Royal Chapel, on the vast Baroque gardens designed by André Le Nôtre. Skilled craftsmen were imported from across Europe. The finest marble was quarried from across France and Italy. What was apparently never seriously considered, at least not with equivalent enthusiasm, was where 20,000 residents and visitors would go to the toilet. The mathematics alone are staggering. At full capacity, Versailles housed not just the royal family, but the entire French court. The nobility of France were required by Louis to live at Versailles as a political strategy, to keep them under his eye and away from their regional power base. Alongside the nobles were their retinues of servants, soldiers, clergy, merchants, craftsmen, tradespeople, and the simply curious. The palace had guest rooms, servant quarters, private apartments, ministerial offices. But what it lacked in any systematic sense was plumbing. There were, it should be noted, some toilet facilities. The French called them chaises percées, or pierced chairs, essentially a wooden seat with a hole positioned over a bucket or a pit. There were also close stools, more elaborate versions of the same concept, often upholstered in velvet and trimmed with gold for the use of royalty. And there were, in various wings of the palace, some rudimentary water closets that drained into cesspits. But these facilities were entirely insufficient for the scale of human occupation. The result was predictable. People went where they could. The gardens of Versailles, so magnificent in the engravings, were a popular destination. The stairwells were another. The corners of corridors, behind curtains, under hedges, in doorways. Contemporary accounts describe the unmistakable signs of mass informal relieving throughout the palace and its grounds. When the court was in full session and the corridors were packed with hundreds of courtiers waiting for audiences, waiting for dinner, waiting for the endless ceremonial events that structured Versailles life. The opportunities to reach any sort of formal facility were limited, and the human body is not interested in scheduling its requirements around court protocol. The Duc de Saint-Simon, whose extraordinary memoirs of Versailles life constitute one of the great primary sources for the period, observed the general condition of the palace, with barely concealed horror and frequent black humor. He noted that the stench in certain parts of the building, particularly in summer, was remarkable even by the standards of an era not known for its olfactory sensitivity. Efforts were made to address the problem. In 1715, the year of Louis XIV's death, there were reportedly approximately 300 privies for the entire palace population. By the reign of Louis XVI, in the later 18th century, some improvements had been made. There are records of over 200 water closets being installed in various parts of the palace, but these numbers remained wildly inadequate for the thousands who moved through Versailles daily. The solution most frequently deployed was the one that has served humanity's sanitary emergencies since time immemorial: perfume. Versailles was drenched in it. Louis XIV, interestingly, was known to dislike strong perfume. In later life, he reportedly banned most scents in his immediate environment, preferring only light orange blossom water. This is somewhat ironic, given that he presided over a palace that arguably needed more perfume than anywhere else in France. The court thus developed what can only be described as a ritual relationship with dirt, acknowledging it implicitly in the extraordinary lengths taken to mask or ignore it, while maintaining publicly the fiction of immaculate, aristocratic refinement. It is 7 o'clock in the morning. You have been awake for some time. You are one of the most powerful men in France, and you have been waiting outside this door since 6. The door opens. The ceremony begins. The lever du roi, the king's rising, was the most significant and most sought-after daily ritual at Versailles, and it stands as perhaps the most spectacularly bizarre example of the court's capacity to transform the most intimate human acts into elaborate public performance. Every morning, Louis XIV was woken, washed, dressed, and prepared for the day in a sequence of carefully choreographed stages, each one attended by a specific, hierarchically determined group of courtiers. The entire process was divided into entries: the grande entrée, the première entrée, the entrée, each admitting different ranks of nobility at successive stages of the royal toilet. The earliest admitted were the premier valet de chambre and the premier médecin, the first chamberlain and the first physician, who slept in the royal bedchamber itself, on call throughout the night. At the first stage of the lever, the grands officiers de la chambre were admitted: the grand chamberlain, the first gentleman of the bedchamber. They brought the king's shift. This was not metaphorical. They literally carried the clean garment to the royal bed, where Louis lay waiting. Then came the princes of the blood, the king's family, near and extended. Then senior nobles and court officials. Then progressively, others of descending rank, until eventually, quite a large crowd was assembled in and around the royal bedchamber, watching Louis XIV conduct what you or I might consider the relatively private business of getting out of bed and putting clothes on. The details of who handed what, in what order, were points of ferocious competition and political significance. The right to hand the king his shirt was one of the most coveted honors at Versailles. Saint-Simon records a memorable incident in which two princes of the blood engaged in whispered but furious argument about precisely this privilege, while Louis, unmoved and impassive as only absolute monarchs can afford to be, waited in politely naked patience. The king ate, also publicly. The Grand Couvert was a formal public dinner at which Louis XIV ate his meals before an audience of courtiers, and on certain days the general public. Versailles was technically accessible to any Frenchman who could dress respectably and obtain a sword. Swords could be hired at the palace gates for this purpose. And so, farmers, merchants, and curious visitors from across the country could and did come to watch the king eat his dinner. Louis ate with excellent appetite and remarkable speed, reportedly consuming quantities that astonished observers. A typical dinner might include several soups, multiple meat courses, a selection of salads, pastries, fruit, and wine. He ate this largely alone at his table, while dozens of people watched him do it. This was not considered strange. It was considered an honor. If the lever was intimate and the dinner was public, there existed a daily ceremony that managed somehow to be both simultaneously. Louis XIV was famous. We might, from our contemporary vantage point, say, infamous, for conducting affairs of state while seated upon his chaise percée. The close stool occupied by the Sun King during these sessions was, in keeping with his status, not exactly what you would find in a peasant's outhouse. It was upholstered, ornate, befitting royalty, and it was positioned, not in a private room, but in a space to which courtiers were routinely admitted during the king's use of it. This was not unusual by the standards of the time. Bodily functions were regarded with considerably less horror than they would come to inspire in later centuries. The Romantic and Victorian eras would introduce the intense privatization of the body that we now take for granted. In medieval and early modern Europe, the great and the powerful routinely received visitors during what we would now consider intensely private moments. Kings had always granted audiences while dressing. The step to granting them while attending to other necessities was, in the context of the age, not enormous. What made Louis XIV's version distinctive was the political theater layered around it. Being admitted to the king's presence during his morning toilet, in any stage of it, was a mark of favor. Standing close to the king, catching his eye, being spoken to, was how careers were made at Versailles. A word from Louis in an informal moment was worth more than a dozen formal petitions. Courtiers competed ferociously for the right to simply be in the room when the king was present, whatever the king happened to be doing in that room. And so they came. Ambassadors, ministers, generals, bishops, men who governed provinces and commanded armies stood deferentially in the royal bedchamber, while Louis XIV went about his morning business, discussing taxation policy, military campaigns, diplomatic marriages. The business of France conducted against a backdrop that might have made a less confident man self-conscious, but which the Sun King bore with the absolute, serene imperturbability of someone who has never, not once in his life, doubted that everything happening in his presence is exactly as dignified as it needs to be. Later, monarchs continued the tradition with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Louis XV, Louis XIV's great-grandson, was said to be rather less delighted by the public nature of royal bodily functions, but submitted to the ceremony as his birthright demanded. Louis XVI, that most reluctant of kings, suffered the indignities of public existence at Versailles, with a kind of bewildered unhappiness that was, in retrospect, probably appropriate. Marie Antoinette, arriving from the comparatively relaxed court of Vienna, reportedly found the ceremony surrounding the royal toilet particularly startling. At Versailles, the Queen's lever was subject to similar ritualized intrusion. The right to hand the Queen her chemise was disputed between ladies of various ranks, and there existed a protocol for what happened when a lady of superior rank arrived midway through the proceedings, requiring the garment already in one lady's hands to be ceremonially transferred to another. Marie Antoinette reportedly found herself standing naked and shivering, waiting while two ladies conducted this elaborate protocol shuffle, and was not always able to maintain the royal composure that the ceremony demanded. She allegedly, on at least one occasion, laughed. It was not, the court noted, quite the done thing. If the rituals of washing and dressing made the royal body a public spectacle, the rituals of medicine made it something stranger still, a kind of national barometer, a flesh and blood weather vane for the health of France itself. Louis XIV's medical history is one of the most comprehensively documented in pre-modern history, not because he was particularly unusual in his ailments, but because his physicians were required to keep meticulous records of every symptom, every treatment, and every bodily function of the royal person. These records, now preserved in French archives, provide a frankly staggering level of detail about the king's digestive system, his teeth, which were largely destroyed by his physicians' well-meaning extractions, his fistula, and the extraordinary range of conditions he endured and survived. The Sun King was, medically speaking, a remarkable specimen of human endurance. He suffered from gout, from diabetes, undiagnosed in his lifetime but evident in retrospect, from a jaw wound so badly treated that portions of his palate were destroyed. His physicians, in their enthusiasm, extracted teeth along with the infected tissue, leaving him with holes in the roof of his mouth, through which food and drink sometimes escaped while he ate. This being, presumably, somewhat awkward during the Grand Couvert. He survived smallpox. He survived typhoid. He survived a series of surgical procedures for an anal fistula that in 1686 became the defining medical event of the French court. The story of Louis XIV's fistula is one of the great set pieces of medical history, and it illuminates the strange relationship between the royal body and the court that surrounded it with peculiar clarity. An anal fistula, an abnormal passage between the anal canal and the skin, is an acutely painful condition. Louis had been suffering from one for some time, treated with increasing ineffectiveness by his court physicians. In 1686, his chief surgeon, Charles-François Félix, was tasked with operating. Félix, with admirable thoroughness and rather questionable ethics, spent several months practicing the procedure on other patients, specifically on patients who had been identified with similar conditions and brought to him for the purpose. He is reputed to have operated on at least 75 people before he felt ready to approach the king. The operation on Louis was performed on November 18, 1686. It was, in the standards of the age, a success. The king recovered, though he required multiple subsequent procedures over the following months. What happened in the court around this event, however, is what makes it historically extraordinary. The fistula became fashionable. This is not a metaphor. This is not hyperbole. Courtiers at Versailles, in their frantic determination to identify with the king in every possible way, began presenting themselves to surgeons complaining of anal fistulas. Some, it is believed, actually had them. Others, in the grip of what one can only describe as extraordinarily committed social performance, apparently fabricated or exaggerated symptoms in order to receive the same treatment as their monarch. Surgeons in Paris found themselves suddenly overwhelmed with noble patients concerned about fistulas. Félix himself became overnight one of the most celebrated men in France. He was ennobled, he was given 300,000 livres, he was granted an estate, and Versailles, briefly, was a place where having a fistula was something to quietly mention at dinner. The historian Antonia Fraser, writing about the Sun King, notes this episode with a mixture of incredulity and dark amusement that seems to be the only appropriate response. It is, she suggests, the ultimate expression of the court's defining pathology, the compulsive mirroring of the king in every aspect of existence, taken to its absolute absurdist conclusion. If Louis had gout, gout became interesting. If Louis had a digestive complaint, digestive complaints were discussed with unprecedented sympathy. If Louis had a fistula, well, one simply did what was necessary. To understand the sanitary culture of Versailles, it is necessary to abandon the modern assumption that cleanliness is simply a practical matter, a question of health, of comfort, of common sense. In 17th and 18th century France, cleanliness was primarily a social performance, and the rules governing it had only a glancing relationship with what we might now consider hygiene. The French aristocracy of this period did not, for the most part, wash their bodies with anything approaching regularity. This was not simple laziness, it was, in a profound sense, ideological. The dominant medical theory of the age held that water was dangerous, that it opened the pores to disease, that bathing weakened the constitution, that the skin was better protected by a layer of natural oils and substances that regular washing would dissolve. Bathing was associated, in the popular imagination, with the medieval public bathhouses that had been blamed for spreading plague and syphilis. A gentleman or lady who bathed too frequently was not considered clean, but rather reckless. What substituted for washing at Versailles and throughout the French aristocracy was what historians have termed the dry toilet, the changing of linen. White linen, clean and frequently changed, was the visible marker of cleanliness and status. A nobleman who changed his shirt twice a day was demonstrating his wealth and refinement. The linen absorbed the oils and dirt of the body. The changing of linen was the washing. Perfume covered whatever remained. The hierarchy of smell at Versailles was, in this light, a direct map of the social hierarchy. The king smelled of orange blossom water and the particular perfumes applied by his household. The highest nobles smelled of expensive imported perfumes and very frequently changed linen. As one descended the social ladder, the quality of perfume diminished and the linen was changed less often. At the very bottom of the palace's complex social ecosystem, the lowest servants, the casual workers, the tradespeople who supplied the court, the performance of cleanliness was simply unavailable, and the smell was, by all contemporary accounts, correspondingly forthright. Hair presented its own complexities. Wigs, those towering powdered structures that define our visual image of the 18th century court, were, among other things, a solution to the problem of head hair that was rarely washed and frequently infested. Lice were an unremarkable feature of aristocratic life. Small ivory or silver scratching implements designed for use beneath wigs were fashionable accessories. The hair beneath the wig was often cut short or shaved. Some courtiers shaved their heads entirely to minimize the problem. The wig itself was powdered with a mixture that included starch, sometimes perfumed with violet or iris. The powdering of wigs was a morning ritual, requiring its own dedicated room, the powdering room, and its own dedicated servants. White powder settled on everything. Combined with the perfume already saturating the air and the more organic odors arising from approximately 20,000 imperfectly washed bodies, the atmosphere of Versailles on a warm day was described by visitors from other countries with a kind of stunned literary effort that suggests the experience resisted easy summarization. The German courts, the English court, the Spanish court, all were familiar with similar conditions. But Versailles operated at a scale that amplified everything. 20,000 people, 700 rooms, one palace, one increasingly fragrant experience. The food at Versailles was, by most accounts, extraordinary. The French royal kitchens employed hundreds of staff, organized in a complex hierarchy that mirrored the social structure of the court itself. There was a department for the roasting meats, a department for the sauces, a department for the bread, a department for the fruit, a department for the preserves. Louis XIV's appetite was legendary. He was said to eat at a single meal quantities that would have incapacitated a lesser man. But the journey of food from the royal kitchens to the royal table was not a short one. The kitchens were located at a considerable distance from the king's apartments, a decision of architectural planning that prioritized the prevention of kitchen fires reaching the main palace over the maintenance of food temperature. By the time dishes arrived at Louis's table, having traveled through the corridors in the hands of servants, they were frequently cold. Louis XIV ate cold food, often as the price of living in the most magnificent palace in Europe. The table itself was a theater of danger, beyond the simple matter of temperature. Poisoning was a genuine concern at the French court. The late 17th century had been darkened by the Affaire des Poisons, a scandal that had revealed the existence of a network of fortune-tellers, poisoners, and black magicians operating at the fringes of Versailles society, accused of providing poisons and abortifacients to noble clients, including, most explosively, Louis XIV's own mistress, Athénaïs de Montespan. The scandal implicated hundreds of people and resulted in dozens of executions. It left a lasting shadow of paranoia over the court's relationship with food. The role of the taster, the official food tester, whose job was to sample royal dishes before the king ate them, was consequently not merely ceremonial. There was genuine belief in the possibility of poisoning, and the protocols around royal food were extensive. Dishes were covered immediately after preparation. The chain of custody was closely watched. The taster consumed small amounts of each course under official observation. Alongside the fear of deliberate poisoning was the omnipresent reality of accidental food spoilage. Without refrigeration, without reliable food safety practices, the elaborate dishes of the royal kitchen were vulnerable to bacterial contamination in ways their creators could not have understood. Food poisoning was common across all levels of society. The medical records of Versailles residents describe recurring intestinal complaints, fevers, and digestive crises that, viewed through a modern lens, look remarkably like foodborne illness. The royal family was not exempt. The infant mortality rate among Louis XIV's legitimate children and grandchildren was catastrophic. Of his 6 legitimate children with Queen Marie-Thérèse, only 1 survived to adulthood, while disease, problematic medical intervention, and simple bad luck all played roles. The dietary and sanitary conditions of Versailles were not without significance. Medical treatment when the ailments arrived was of limited comfort. The dominant treatments of the period were bleeding, purging, and enemas, procedures whose theoretical basis in humoral medicine made them seem logical to practitioners, but which in practice frequently weakened patients who needed strengthening. Louis XIV himself underwent a remarkable number of enemas in his lifetime. His medical records suggest the number ran to several hundred over the course of his reign, administered both therapeutically and preventively. The enema was considered not just a medical intervention, but a form of maintenance, a regular clearing of the system that a prudent man undertook as a matter of course. All of this was, naturally, carefully documented, discussed, and in the peculiar way of Versailles, subtly socialized. The king's bowel movements were a matter of medical record. His physicians reported on their frequency, consistency, and character, with the diligence of scientists recording natural phenomena. These records were not private documents. They were official medical logs maintained by the royal physicians, who were themselves significant court figures with their own political agendas and social ambitions. The experience of women at Versailles was defined by a particular cruelty. The demand that they maintain at all times and under all circumstances an appearance of impossible elegance in conditions that made this aspiration almost comically difficult to achieve. The fashions of the court required elaborate structures beneath the dress, the grand pannier, a framework of hoops that spread the skirt outward to widths that made narrow doorways impractical. Corsets compressed the torso in ways that, over time, deformed the ribcage. The towering coiffures of the mid-18th century required hours of preparation, were maintained for days without disassembly, and during that time provided warm and hospitable environments for wildlife. Contemporary jokes about the things found in fashionable ladies' hair were not entirely jokes. Getting dressed took considerable time. For ladies of the court, the process of dressing for a formal occasion might take the better part of a morning, requiring multiple attendants, hot irons, quantities of powder, elaborate pinning and lacing procedures. Getting undressed was similarly complex. In between, the long hours of court attendance the standing in corridors, the sitting through ceremonies, the dancing at balls. The body made its entirely reasonable biological demands, and the response available to a lady in full court dress was limited. Chamber pots were part of the solution. Small rooms adjacent to larger reception areas sometimes served as retreats. But the practical difficulties were real and acknowledged in the correspondence and memoirs of women who lived through the experience. Pregnancy at Versailles added its own layer of complexity. Royal births were attended by enormous crowds. It was tradition that members of the court witness royal childbirths to prevent any possibility of infant substitution, a concern with both dynastic and political dimensions. Marie Antoinette's first confinement in 1778 was attended by such a packed audience that spectators climbed onto furniture for a better view. The room became unbearably hot, and the Queen fainted immediately after delivery. Louis XVI, who was present, threw open the windows, an action that was considered by the anxious physicians present to be borderline assault on the royal recovery. The life of a lady at Versailles was in this light a sustained negotiation between the demands of fashion and performance on one hand and the stubborn reality of having a human body on the other. The women who managed this negotiation successfully, who appeared serene and immaculate while managing the practical realities of court existence, were exhibiting a feat of will and performance art that deserves more credit than history has generally given it. The court of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, which ended so catastrophically in 1789, was already living in a kind of gilded deterioration before the revolution arrived to make the deterioration definitive. The palace itself showed the effects of a century of intense occupation. Buildings require maintenance. Versailles, maintained by a court system that was simultaneously the most expensive administrative structure in Europe and chronically financially mismanaged, received maintenance that was sporadic, inadequate, and perpetually delayed by competing financial demands. Visitors to Versailles in the 1770s and 1780s noted the contrast between the splendor of the great staterooms. The Hall of Mirrors was still breathtaking, and the shabbiness of the private quarters, the peeling paint in back corridors, the crumbling stucco, the drains that no longer functioned. The social and sanitary conditions had not fundamentally improved since Louis XIV's reign. The palace was somewhat less crowded. The requirement for the entire nobility to reside at Versailles had relaxed somewhat under Louis XV and Louis XVI, but it remained a place of extraordinary density, imperfect drainage, and magnificent smell. The revolutionary pamphlets of the late 1780s deployed the physical conditions of Versailles as political ammunition with considerable effectiveness. The image of the court as a place of deliberate excess, consuming the wealth of France in perfume and powdered wigs while the people starved, was a simplification, but it had enough truth in it to resonate. The contrast between the ceremonial magnificence of the court and the practical squalor of its daily operation was, in the hands of revolutionary propagandists, available as either comedy or outrage, depending on the need of the moment. When the crowd from Paris arrived at Versailles on October 5, 1789, the women of Paris marching through the rain demanding bread, they found the palace essentially as it had always been, magnificent in its parts, complicated in its whole, and smelling of the particular combination of perfume, humanity, and history that had always defined it. The royal family was removed to Paris the following day, ending, effectively, the court life of Versailles. The palace never again served as a royal residence. It became a museum under Napoleon and the Restoration monarchies, and then, definitively, a national monument. The tourists who walk through it today, marveling at the Hall of Mirrors, standing in the royal bedchamber, photographing the grand gardens, are walking through a building from which all the complexity has been carefully removed. The smells have been replaced by the neutral, climate-controlled air of a preservation museum. The crowds move through in an orderly fashion with audio guides. Everything is very clean. Versailles teaches, if it teaches anything, that civilization's grandest projects are always also human ones, messy, impractical, smelly, riddled with contradiction. The men and women who lived there were not different in their basic nature from the rest of humanity. They were hungry, tired, occasionally ill, often bored, and in permanent possession of human bodies that did not care about hierarchy. What they built around those bodies, the rituals, the ceremonies, the fashions, the elaborate performances of power and refinement, was the attempt to impose order on disorder, to transform the merely human into the transcendently political. It worked, up to a point. The levée du roi was, among other things, a genuine political instrument. It bound the nobility to the king through daily performed loyalty. It created visible hierarchies that were impossible to ignore. It made the king himself into a kind of living sun around which the court perpetually orbited. But it could not make the palace smell better. It could not prevent fistulas or food poisoning or head lice or the simple biological insistence of 20,000 human bodies doing what human bodies do. The sun, king himself, who projected more carefully constructed power than almost any monarch in history, who turned his own morning ablutions into state theater, spent his final years in a body that was arthritic, partially toothless, and riddled with the complications of undiagnosed diabetes. He died in 1715 of gangrene. His leg turned black. His physicians did what they could. He was 76 years old, which was an extraordinary age for the time, and he had reigned for 72 of those years, which remains the longest verified reign of any monarch in European history. He had built the most magnificent palace in the world and had governed France. Not always well, but always absolutely, for 7 decades. He had also, one morning in 1686, held court while seated on a chaise percée, discussing with his ministers the affairs of the most powerful kingdom in Europe, and had not considered this unusual because it was not unusual. It was simply how things were done, and the courtiers who stood at a respectful distance, waiting for their moment to speak, had considered it an honor to be there. That is perhaps the most human thing about Versailles. Not the splendor. The splendor is easy to understand, but the remarkable capacity of human beings to construct meaning around anything, to take the most ordinary, unavoidable, fundamentally democratic facts of physical existence, the body's requirements, its vulnerabilities, its inevitable decay, and transform them through ritual and hierarchy and sheer collective performance into ceremony. To make of a man getting out of bed an act of state, to make of a fistula a fashion, to stand in a corridor that smells unmistakably of 5,000 years of unresolved sanitation, wearing silk and powder and half a month's salary on your back and think, yes, this is where I want to be. This is the center of the world. And for a while, it was.